Hello everyone. In my previous video, I was showing how to use the Azure DevOps pipeline to set up and deploy Azure resources of an integration solution. And it was a logic app and a Cosmos DB database set up so that data accepted by the HTTP trigger of a logic app was converted into another format and saved as a document in the Cosmos DB database. Today I was going to show how to optimize the deployment process. If you feel that you're not quite in context of this discussion, what I will be talking about in this video, then edit that you see the previous video first. So just click on the link which I will put in the description down below. Everyone understands that a solution implemented with Azure resources may be quite complex, may contain many Azure resources tied together, working together, and deployment of such a solution may quickly become a quite complex task by itself. So when you develop a deployment solution, you have to think about optimizing this process, reusing your functionality. I can give you an example of a solution like, for instance, you may have a big solution consisting of several integrations where each integration uses almost the same resources or the same resources. The only difference is how the data flow process the data. But for instance, the source system and the destination system are the same, and the steps in the workflow, the integration workflow, are also the same, or these steps are encapsulated in the same type of Azure resources. So your deployment of all these integrations becomes very similar. And in this case, you have to think about reusing the deployment steps of these Azure resources in each of your integrations. And it will work like you have the same pattern, the same procedure of deploying the Azure resources, and then you have templates of resources like logic apps, where you provide the specific logic app template file, and this logic app template file contains the particular logic used by this particular integration. So the difference lays in the actions of the logic app, while the similar things are encapsulated in the deployment commands grouped together. And I was going to show you how it works with depicting this as follows. In the previous video, my deployment was designed like this. I have an Azure DevOps platform or environment, which has a pipeline find. This pipeline uses a YAML file, while the YAML file contains the deployment stages. The first one was publishing artifacts, which takes the source code from the code repository. And the second stage implements the deployment of this code into Azure. In my particular case, the deployment stage consisted of two tasks. The first one deployed the Cosmos DB account and database and container inside it with a specific bicep file written for this. And the second task was about deployment of logic app, and there was a particular bicep which defined the logic app content. And today I will show a sort of optimized model where the first elements are the same up to the YAML pipeline file, with the first stage publishing the artifact. And the second stage is also about deployment, but in this case, the deployment stage will use a template YAML file, which will contain the relevant tasks: deployment of a Cosmos DB account and the logic app. Just the same model using the separate bicep files. What improvement I get here is that this template YAML file can be reused to deploy different integrations. So I can simply reuse the same template with different bicep files so that the Cosmos DB account will be deployed separately for a particular integration. And the logic app will be deployed with its own bicep file. Maybe Cosmos DB is not so suitable in this scenario because usually the Cosmos DB is a shared resource in the integration, so that one Cosmos DB account is used by multiple integrations. My example is very simplified, so I use the Cosmos DB in one integration here. In one of my future videos, I will show how to use the shared resources. But for now, the Cosmos DB is used in a particular integration. Just please have note that this is not ideal model. Of course, the Cosmos DB is sort of a shared resource. But let's go further. Now let's switch to Visual Studio Code. And I will continue working with YAML file, with pipeline file, and resources, Azure resources. I will start by creating a separate folder, and I'm going to call it shared templates. This folder will contain shared YAML templates files, and I will create a file inside this folder. The name will be solution deployment YAML. So I created a solution deployment YAML file which will contain the deployment tasks which will be used to deploy one integration. I go to my release pipeline file, which I used in the Azure DevOps as a deployment pipeline. This file has two stages. The first one is publishing artifacts. The second one is a stage of deployment of resources. And here I'm going to take this part, starting with jobs, and take a copy of it and paste it into the shared template. And then I will adapt the file to work as a template. The template file may not have any variables, can have only parameters. So I have to define the parameters which will be used throughout these tasks, and I will replace the constant parameters with parameters accepted by the template. I have prepared these parameters. The definition of parameters starts with the keyword parameters and then follows the list of them. I used to use the undefined word as a default value for a parameter, and this helps me to find the error if I forget initialize the parameter in the code calling this template. So if I just forget to initialize the, for instance, Cosmo account name parameter, I will get an account name called undefined, and this will be clearly visible, indicating that I did an error. Okay, then let's go through the code and replace the attributes of the tasks with these parameters. The deployment name remains the same. Deployment scope is resource group. These two variables are taken from the variable group of DevOps. Action is the same. Resource group name. I have defined a parameter instead of the variable which was used before. So it became a parameter now, and it's used together with the environment. It was in a variable environment dev, but now I have the parameter env, which will contain the environment name. I have to correct it here as well. This will show in which environment the deployment is being done, the environment itself, the resource group name. These attribute will cause creation of a resource group with this name in Azure. And I will use a separate resource group per environment. And the resource group will have a suffix indicating the environment. This was my intention. Location was taken from the variable, but now it is a parameter, so I have to replace the variables with parameters. The file location, artifact name is the parameter now, so it's not variable but parameter. The location of the file is the same, in the same folder and the same bicep file. Account name, Cosmos DB account name is a globally unique name, so I will have to use the value first from the parameters, and plus I have to use the environment name to make the name different. Database name, I have to have the possibility for selecting which database name will be used. So it is a parameter. And the same for container name. I use the parameter. Parameters. Oh, sorry. Here is the error. Parameters. It's done for the first task, which deploys the database. The next one is for deployment of the logic app. And here I will change this. One moment. Here I see that I've done an error. Parameters. And the same for the environment. Correct now. Yeah, I just can copy this from here. Resource group name. Variables location, not variables, but it will be parameters. Artifact name is my parameter. Logic app name, we want to check. Yes, it's a parameter. Parameters. Cosmos DB account name. Parameter. And location. And by the way, since I decided to use parameters for database name and container name, I need to define them in the bicep file for deployment of the logic app. So here in addition to the Cosmos DB account name, I have to define the parameter for the database name and for the container name, and by the way, I don't like this theme for bicep file. It doesn't fit well. I will choose the modern. Good. Then we'll go to the logic app resource definition, and I will add two parameters to the logic app. One is the Cosmos DB database name, with default value Cosmos DB database name of type string, and the similar parameter for the Cosmos DB container name. This is an extra F, which I don't need. And the string, the type has to be taken into quotes. Cosmos DB container name, and I use the parameter container name here, and then I will use this logic app parameter in the action which sends data to Cosmos DB account. And to use a parameter instead of the literal, instead of the constant value, I will replace it with the name, with the name of parameter, which was called Cosmos DB database name. Put it in here, and the same pattern will be used for the container name, which I will place in here. Cosmos DB container, container name. Looks good now. So the logic app bicep is prepared to use the additional parameters. And going back to the YAML template file, I have to add these two parameters in the task. So I will do it like this. And let's add these parameters to the task. So it's database name goes in here, and the container name goes in here, container name. Looks good now. Then I go back to the pipeline file, and instead I will use the template. And here I have to specify the path to the template YAML file, which is in the shared templates folder. And solution, yeah, I may do it in a simpler way. I take the relative path and then put it in here like this. And then the template attribute is followed by parameters. And these parameters I have to take from the template file. So I take them, I copy them and paste here. They have to go with an additional indentation after parameters. So I put them like this. Instead of undefined word, I have to specify a value to the parameter. So here I will use dev target resource group. I have a variable in the main template file for the resource group. I also remember, no, it will be specified like this. But I remember that this name of the resource group will be modified and will get the suffix of the environment name. Location. The location is a variable. Very simple. Artifact name. Yes, it is a variable. Just the same way. Cosmos DB account name. I don't have a variable for it, but I can define it. It's better to have them defined as variables because it's easier to make a decision afterwards whether to continue using them as local variables or put them into the variable group of the Azure DevOps. But for now, it's good. It's suitable to use them as local variables. The name of the Cosmos DB account here was NoSQL CMS integration, and it will get the suffix of the environment name. If we have a look into the deployment task, the account name parameter is composed of the two parts, the itself name taken from the parameter and the hyphen separated environment name. As a result of my modifications of the YAML template, I've got the code using template parameters instead of previously used variables. Now back to main pipeline file. I have created a local variable here, and I will replace it with the variable. The same will be used for the database name, Cosmos database name. Let's call it CMS. And finally, the container name. The container was customers. So I will have to provide the value from the variable, Cosmos database name, and the same for container name. Logic app name. Yes, I have a variable for the logic app name. Looks good. So, as you see, instead of using these two tasks, I just use the call of a template in the main pipeline file. It doesn't give me a big benefit now in this simple integration solution, but let's imagine if there are much more tasks here in order to deploy an integration. And in this case, the benefit becomes more visible. These two variables I can remove. I don't need them. And by the way, I forgot to remove this variable from the display name. I will use the static value for now. So now I'm ready to deploy my solution with the new version of the release pipeline. And for this, I have to upload the changes to the code repository. And by the way, those who saw my previous video, remember that these two files, a resource JSON and resource bicep, for conversion of the ARM template code into bicep code. I did it with use of Azure command line interface command, az bicep decompile, and then the file parameter, where the file parameter is the file containing the ARM template code. So I take the relative path of this file. I place these two files into a separate folder so that they are not mixed with other files. And then I paste the ARM template code into this file, run this command, and this command creates the bicep file. I will be able to use this bicep code in my bicep files for definition of Azure resources. Okay, but back to this. These files always pop up in my list of files for uploading to the code repository, and I want to avoid this. It's annoying because I don't want to have them in the code repository. They are just local files. And for this, I'm going to use a git ignore file, which can be created with the command .NET new git ignore. The command creates the git ignore file. Those who don't know, this file allows for specifying which files should not be uploaded to the Git code repository. And here in the first section, and user-specific files, I will include a mask for my files. I put a temp part into the file name to include it into git ignore temp, and the asterisk instead of extension of the file as well. So all the files with temp will be ignored, and you see that they became of gray color now. And if I switch back to the source control, they disappeared in the list of files for synchronization with the Git code repository. And I get a git ignore file instead. This will be uploaded to the code repository. And this is what I want to do. So I have these changes. And the commit will have name use of template YAML. And I push the commit to the code repository. And now I'm ready to test my changed release pipeline. Let's switch to the Azure portal. I'm going to show that I have only these three resource groups. The new resource group will be created with the name rg-cms-deployment. I go to the Azure portal, so I can go to pipelines and run it. After a bit of waiting, I've got the pipeline successfully run, and now it's time to switch back to the Azure portal, and I can find a new resource group created with the suffix dev, as I wished to have a resource group created for the dev environment. The resource group contains 3 resources: the logic app, the Cosmos DB account, and the connection to the Cosmos DB account. As a final step, I would like to show you how to manage deployment to multiple environments. As you saw, I used static value for specifying the environment, and it was dev. But now let's assume you have several environments, and there may be 3, 4, 5, whatever, depending on the size of the project. And some projects are huge and they require multiple environments for different stages in the software production. So what's your choice in this case? One of the approaches is that you take this part and copy it every time you need a new environment. Like, for instance, UAT here will deploy the resources into the resource group with the UAT suffix, which will present a UAT environment, and so on per environment. But this is inefficient, as you have to be careful about what values you use in calling of this template and a specification of this stage. Like, for instance, the variables are taken from the variable group, and the variable group name has to be corrected as well per environment. Like this, if you forget to correct this, you'll get an error deployment. Another approach, instead of using multiple stages, is to use variables. And here we go to the template. And instead of using the environment parameter, I will use an environment array of parameters. How it works? It's pretty simple, but requires some modification in the way we define the parameters in the file. Instead of the environment parameter, I will use the parameter named environments of type object. And here I can specify the default value. And the structure of the object will be as follows. It will contain the name attribute, stage attribute, and depends on attribute. I have to align the indentation first of all. And you see that I have chosen now to use the different definition of the parameters, which defines the name and the type to be able to specify it as an object. So I will restructure all these remaining parameters in the same way. The new definition of parameters will look like this. Indentation has to be corrected here and here. Yeah, just like this. And then I need to make the corresponding changes in the main release file. The change will be done here. Instead of the environment name, the parameter will be named environment without any value. And then an environment has an attribute name where I will use dev. And another environment will have name UAT. And in addition to these attributes, I have to add values for stage and depends on. The stage will be used to assign a name to a stage. And on is used to assign how the stage will be run in the sequence of deployment. You can see that my previous implementation was that a stage is defined with this name, and it has a depends on attribute, which indicates that this stage is dependent on the publish artifacts, which is the name of the previous stage. So the deployment stage will run after the publishing stage is completed and successful. And then here I need to give a name to this stage, which for the development environment will have name deployment to dev. For UAT, it will have name deployment to UAT. And the depends on will be for dev publishing artifacts. For UAT, the dependency will be on the deployment to dev. And the last change in this file will be that since we are going to operate stages, this definition of the stage has to be removed up to the template definition. And I have to check the indentation, and it has to be the same as for the first stage. Like the main template file is ready to work for deployment of multi-environments, but there is a change has to be done in the solution template as well, in addition to changes in the parameters. And the change is about what we deploy. Previously, I deployed the jobs, and the job was deployment, had 2 tasks. Now I will deploy a stage, and instead of jobs, we'll have stages. And then after stages, I will use the iteration of environments. So here I enter environments, and each environment, this is a variable representing one element of the collection of environments. So the environments is my parameter. And since it will be a list of environments, I will run a sequence of the tasks per environment. Then the next will be a stage, and the stage name will be taken from the stage attribute of the environment. Just remember that I have the stage defined per event as an attribute with the stage name. The next one is the display name for the stage. Here I can use the name attribute of the environment. Don't forget the indentation. And the display name should start with the stage level. The next important attribute is depends on. And here I specify which stage this one depends on. And I take this from the attribute depends on of the environment. The next is definition of the variables group which will be used for execution of this stage. So here I define the group with the name demo deployment, and the suffix will be taken from the environment name. I have to remind you that the variable groups are those specified in the DevOps portal under pipelines in the library. And here you can define your variable groups. And the important thing is that you differentiate them or designate with the environment, which allows you to use if you use a subscription ID as a variable, this allows you to deploy your solution into different subscriptions. which is a typical requirement when you need to deploy your production environment into a separate subscription. So it becomes very simple when you define your production variable group with its own subscription ID and its own connection name, because a different subscription requires a different connection in the DevOps. Again, I remind you that this variable connection name is taken from the project settings, and in the project settings you have to find the service connection, and the service connection is created per subscription. So if you want to do a deployment into a different subscription, you have to specify a separate connection in that. Okay, having that said, let's go back to the Visual Studio Code, and I continue making changes to the YAML template. This, again, the variable group selected for the current environment. And then we approach it to the last thing, to the jobs, and the job is deployment. So we have to align the intention so that it goes with the jobs section. And here, the values which refer the environment has to be replaced with the local variable environment. So I will reuse the same. I can take this environment name instead of parameter. I take this. I'm gonna check. Yeah, these uses of the environment parameter has to be replaced with the environment name. The last is here. The last one. Like this. And having these changes done, we've got a template which can be used for deployment of the same resources represented by these tasks into several environments specified by the environments variable. Back to the main pipeline file. Here we have these environments specified as a list of environments. So instead of replicating the same template call several times, I will just define a list of environments. And here there may be production, there will be production, of course, and there may be other environments as well included. So I upload these changes to the code repository. And I'm gonna run the same pipeline again. Back to the DevOps with the pipelines. My expectation is that I will have an additional resource group with a UAT suffix created. So the deployment actually creates two resource groups now, dev and UAT. You can see that I've got an additional stage here, deployment to UAT. This is the list of stages of my deployment. And by the way, I can control whether I want to deploy to a particular environment by checking the box, checking off the box. So I choose both and run the pipeline. And here I've got an additional stage depicted like this. And by the way, while the deployment is going on, I will switch back to the Visual Studio and give a comment on definition of the environments. By specifying the depends on, I can control whether I want the deployment runs in a serial way, so that each environment is deployed after the one each after another, or I can, for instance, run them parallel if I replace sequential dependency with a dependency from the publishing artifact stage, for instance. So here you see that both environments depend on a previous stage, and then both will be deployed parallel. But usually I don't want this. And I don't want the parallel deployment because I'm interested in deployment into the UAT environment only if the deployment to dev environment succeeded. If it fails, it doesn't make sense to deploy the same solution further. Let's check what is going on in the DevOps. The deployment to the dev environment is ongoing on its final stage. And you see that the display of the stage name, stage title, shows which environment this stage deploys to. Deployment to the UAT environment has started. After waiting some time, I can see now that the deployment to the UAT environment is finished and succeeded. Then I go to the Azure portal to check the results, refresh the list of resource groups, and yeah, I've got a second resource group created for the UAT environment. And you can see that the resources are exactly the same, except that the name of the Cosmos DB account is composed for the UAT environment. So in this video, I wanted to show how you can set a solution for deployment of Azure resources so that it becomes efficient to deploy different Azure resources to the different resource groups and to build up a solution for creation of resources in multiple environments in a smooth and efficient way. As I said earlier, I'm a professional IT consultant and I use this approach in my solutions, which I develop for my customers. It would be interesting to know your suggestions about this approach, and please feel free to write your questions and suggestions in the video. Thank you, and see you next time. Goodbye.